February 1st, 1921, Amsterdam. Quote, "Dinner with Einstein. Talked about God and humanity. I said, the human, with his endlessly colorful fantasy and intelligence, rests in God like the pearl in the oyster. To which Einstein countered, on the contrary, the deeper one drills down into nature, the more respect one has for God." Imagine, if you will, a man sitting at a cafe table in the Weimar Republic in the mid-1920s, impeccably dressed, tailored suit, elegant cane, an aristocrat. But if you lean closer, you notice he's scribbling in a small notebook, recording in amazing detail what he's seeing around him, the people he's interacting with. The man is Count Harry Kessler. He was called that Red Count, an aristocratic socialist, a product of privilege and a social reformer, a soldier and a pacifist, a patron of the avant-garde and high culture, born into a wealthy Anglo-German family, and spent his life in a constant balancing act between Germany and France, between tradition and modernism, between the old Europe of emperors and the volatile new Europe of revolutions, avant-garde art, nightclubs, and dictators. Welcome to the Weimar Spectacle, where I explore the brief and extraordinary life of the Weimar Republic. My name is Bremner Fletcher Duffy, singer, actor, and theater maker, and I've spent years and years and years performing songs and theater from the Weimar period, and I am inspired and maybe more than a little obsessed by that moment in time. I will put images for this episode, along with the transcription of the text, onto my website, bremnersings.com, BREMNERSINGS.com. Just click on the Weimar podcast link on the homepage. And as you know, my big, absurd idea for these podcasts is that the Weimar Republic invented everything about the modern world, and we are still dealing with the possibilities and problems that it gave to us. And to prove this possibly, probably, likely unprovable idea, I'll be exploring the arts, the politics, the science, the social innovations of the Weimar period, and, of course, the terrible and the irresistible rise of the Nazi Party. So, Count Harry Kessler is remembered today less for what he did, although he did quite a lot, than for what he wrote, his diaries. Kept over 6 decades, are one of the most extraordinary documents of the 20th century. They record conversations that he had with everyone from Rodin and Rilke to Einstein, Strauss, Cocteau, Hofmannsthal, and Diaghilev. They also record his impressions of the great turning points of modern history, because he was often right there in the center of it all. The First World War, the Weimar Republic, the rise of Nazism. Kessler was very much a man of his moment. He was restless, visionary, and conflicted, and his diaries span half a century and read like backstage passes to European intellectual history. He saw it all coming. The collapse of empires, the rise of totalitarianism, and he feared it would mean the end of European civilization. So in this episode, we're going to trace the arc of Kessler's life with special attention to his Weimar years, when he tried with extraordinary energy to build cultural bridges across a divided Europe. I'll take a look at his privileged origins, his aesthetic vision, his wartime disillusionment, and his relentless advocacy for art as a force for peace and meaning. So this is a man who saw Europe through its most dramatic transformations. He went from Belle Epoque salons to literally to the blood-soaked trenches of World War I and onwards to the avant-garde heart of Weimar modernism. He was diplomat, diarist, publisher, pacifist, aesthete, and a cultural lightning rod. He spent his youth shuttling between Paris, London, and Germany, absorbing languages, mannerisms, and a sense of the world's interconnectedness, that would define him for his whole life. He was educated at elite schools. He grew into the image of the cultured European gentleman, made travels to Italy and France, which began an interest in classical ideas of beauty and form, setting the tone for his entire life's pursuit to imagine art as a transcendent, unifying force for good. Count Harry Kessler was born in Paris on May 23, 1868. His father, Adolf William Kessler was a banker from Hamburg. His mother, Alice Harriet Bloss Lynch, was a beautiful Anglo-Irish woman with aristocratic ties from a distinguished family in County Clare in Ireland. So right from birth, Harry belonged to two worlds, the German bourgeoisie and the Anglo-Irish aristocratic gentry. Kessler's upbringing was multilingual, multicultural, and transnational. There were many rumors about a supposed affair between Kaiser William I and Countess Alice Kessler. The swift rise of the Kessler family led to a legend that either Harry or his sister were the illegitimate offspring of the Empress and Alice. Adolf William Kessler, Harry's father, was given a noble title in 1879, and Harry inherited those titles on his father's death. This complex heritage between two countries, between various aristocratic and bourgeois backgrounds, gave him, as one biographer put it, quote, the consciousness of a European rather than a nationalist. He would never quite belong to one country. He was German, yes, but he grew up speaking fluent English and French, spent his childhood moving between Paris, Hamburg, and the English countryside. He was educated first in Paris and then from 1880 at St. George's School, Ascot, an English boarding school where one of his classmates was Winston Churchill. He was given governesses, tutors, summer trips to spas, grand tours of Italy, but he himself was a bookish, precocious child, hungry for culture. He devoured Goethe, Shakespeare, and the French symbolists, the new writing from France. He studied law eventually in Bonn and Leipzig, and his diaries from these years, when you read them, it's a young man already both deeply self-conscious about his possibilities and his talents, but also incredibly ambitious. Here's a line from one of his early diary entries written when he was almost 20. Quote, I feel I am destined to stand between nations, to absorb the best of each and to create a synthesis, a harmony that is lacking in our divided Europe. Yes, sounds like a pretentious 19-year-old, but in a way, that's exactly what Kessler spent the rest of his life trying to do. While at university, he became fascinated with art and philosophy. He traveled then frequently to Paris, where he mingled in salons and galleries. As a student, Kessler was among a group of students invited in 1891 to meet the former Chancellor Otto von Bismarck at his residence in Kissingen. After spending an afternoon drinking coffee with Bismarck, Kessler wrote that Bismarck still had an impressive voice, but, quote, the longer and apparently, the more freely the prince spoke, the more the feeling of numbed helplessness grew stronger. His conversation had something ghost-like, as if we had hauled him from a company of dead contemporaries out of the grave. I think Kessler always felt of himself that he was moving into the future, away from these dead contemporaries. He met artists like Pierre Bonnard. He met Auguste Rodin in Paris. He also discovered the intoxicating world of Wagnerian opera, the Gesamtkunstwerk, one of Wagner's incredible titles for his work, which means kind of an entire world in a piece of art, the total art, art that would combine music, poetry, drama, text. Everything would be inside one piece of art. That was Wagner's vision for his operas and for vision of art as a transformative, almost religious power. And that idea hit Kessler like lightning. In Germany, Kessler began to move in elite circles as befit his aristocratic status and his wealth. His charm, his wealth, his cosmopolitan flair made him a welcome guest at any party. But he was not simply content to drift along as a dilettante. He wanted to shape culture. He wanted to be a mediator between old traditions and new movements. By the 1890s, the young Kessler was in love with the modern, gravitating to artists and thinkers who were pushing the boundaries of their forms. Auguste Rodin, Edouard Vuillard, Hugo von Hofmannsthal. These were all artists who at the time were at the cutting edge of their work. Kessler became a director at the Museum of Decorative Arts in Weimar, where he revolutionized cultural practices and championed the brand new, amazing Art Nouveau style. Kessler was a great believer in the concept of Bildung, a completely untranslatable German word that refers to German language, which does this all the time. It takes one word, which means a million things. It refers to a whole process of artistic and moral self-cultivation. And it holds that if a person listens to beautiful music, reads great books and poems, admires beautiful paintings, architecture, and sculpture, and immerses themselves in that eventually it will make that person into a spiritually better human being. One of his earliest and most important friendships was with the writer Hugo von Hofmannsthal, the Austrian poet and playwright. They met in the 1890s when Hofmannsthal was just beginning his incredible career, and Hofmannsthal later wrote about Kessler, quote, "He seemed to me a man born to be at the center of things, a man who could speak with princes and with painters, with generals and with poets, and find the thread that bound them all." And that thread, the belief that art and culture could unify and give meaning to a life, and indeed to an entire era, that's what would define Kessler's life. So by the late 1890s, he's publishing art criticism, writing essays, and building friendships with artists across Europe. His diaries from these years are full of sharp, witty sketches of people he encountered, a dinner with Bonnard in Paris, a lecture by one of Nietzsche's disciples in Leipzig, a night at the opera in Vienna. He writes, quote, "We sat in Rodin's studio until dusk, the smell of clay and plaster in the air, the half-finished figures looming around us like gods. Rodin spoke little, but his silence was itself like a kind of discourse, a weight pressing upon us. I felt in that moment that art, true art, was a form of religion." By the turn of the century, Harry Kessler had fashioned himself into something quite unique, a cosmopolitan aristocrat who was also a modernist, a mediator between German tradition and the European avant-garde, and a writer, a diarist who was already beginning to see himself as a witness to history. He was instrumental in introducing French and British avant-garde ideas into German circles, especially through his connections with artists like Stéphane Mallarmé and Oscar Wilde. His circle included writers, sculptors, composers, and designers all across Europe. He thought of himself as a conduit between cultures, and that cultural diplomacy, which he so loved, he hoped would forge connections between different countries through shared artistic visions. And this is all long before UNESCO or the current European Union imagined such a possibility. Kessler was gay, and like other German homosexuals at the time, he lived in fear of being convicted under the infamous paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code that banned homosexual acts in the Reich. A key element in Kessler's politics was a call for, quote, "a version of sexual liberation, of uninhibited sensuality, to create a society free of the hypertrophy of shame around human sexuality." Kessler was utterly heartbroken when one of his lovers, the handsome Bavarian aristocrat and officer cadet Otto von Dungern, chose to marry in order to hide his homosexuality and improve his prospects of promotion. In 1904, at 36, Kessler founds what would become his life's work, the Cranach Press, named after the German Renaissance painter Lucas Cranach. And its goal was ambitious. He wanted to produce books that were artworks, and he wanted to bring together artistic influences in those books from across Europe. So one of the great masterpieces is a version of Shakespeare's Hamlet with woodcuts by Edward Gordon Craig and translation into German, by Kessler's friend Gerhard Hauptmann. So in early 1900, we're still talking about Imperial Germany. The Kaiser Wilhelm II is still under control, and in that period, we often picture a stiff militaristic society with spiked helmets and parades and heavy architecture of the power of empire. But beneath that surface, even at that time, leading into the Weimar Republic, there is this incredible fermentation of art and culture. Modernism is bubbling up, Art Nouveau symbolism, new ideas about design and aesthetics are challenging those stiff official paradigms of culture, and Harry Kessler is right in the middle of it, pushing forward these ideas which would then spring into full life during the Weimar Republic. One of his great projects was his involvement at this point with the German Werkbund, a group of artists, designers, and industrialists who wanted to improve everyday life through better design. Again, a foreshadowing of the Bauhaus, which springs to life in the Weimar Republic. Kessler collaborated with a Belgian Art Nouveau designer, and together they promoted a vision of art that was functional, elegant, and democratic, which was completely radical for Imperial Germany, where official taste was heavy, intense, all about history and full of neoclassical references and bombast. A diary entry from 1902 captures his role as a connector between these worlds. Quote, "At lunch with Hofmannsthal, I spoke of Rodin and Bonnard, and in the evening with Van de Velde, I argued for a German style that could match the French. Always I felt myself standing on a bridge, one foot in France, one in Germany, carrying fragments across." In the rigid nationalistic atmosphere of Imperial Germany, Kessler's cosmopolitanism, they don't like it. His political liberalism, his openness to French influence, earns him the nickname the Red Count, and that is not meant as a compliment, although he picked it up later in life and sort of embraced it. Conservatives considered him decadent and unpatriotic, but I think Kessler actually thrives on being an outsider. In fact, he seems to believe that by putting himself on the margins of things, between nations, between movements, he could see more clearly a way forward to bring them all together. When he does become director of the Weimar Museum of Decorative Art in 1907, he champions modern art, collecting works that shock the conservative public, but he also turns the museum into a hub of intellectual exchange. A friend later remarks, "In Kessler's salon at the museum, one might meet a general, a ballet dancer, a socialist, deputy, and a French poet, all in the same evening, all speaking as if they belonged together. It was a miracle of harmony, though it rarely lasted beyond midnight." That miracle of harmony was Kessler's dream, that art could dissolve boundaries and unite people across classes and nations. When the First World War breaks out in August 1914, Kessler is 46 years old. World War I had laid down battle lines that Kessler had spent his life trying to avoid, and with his connections, his money, his background in England and France, he could have found a way to sit it all out and avoid the war entirely, avoid service, but instead he volunteers as a soldier for Germany. He's commissioned as an officer and serves on the horrendous, nightmarish Western Front. His diaries from the war are an incredible record of that period, not just of battles, but of the psychological and cultural impact of the war. In September 1914, after witnessing the aftermath of the Battle of the Marne, he writes, "The earth itself seems to have bled. Fields churned into mud, the bodies of boys lying twisted as if asleep, and over all a silence so deep it seemed indecent to breathe. This is not war as we imagined it. This is organized suicide." He fights bravely. He's awarded the Iron Cross, but the war in a way breaks him. Well, he's actually discharged because he's psychologically damaged. And before that, he moves back and forth between the horror of the trenches and the salons of Berlin, where he attends dinners with diplomats and artists. And he writes bitterly, quote, "In Berlin, champagne flows and the ladies chatter about uniforms. At the front, boys drown in shell craters. Europe is eating itself alive." His faith that art and culture could unify nations seems incredibly naive to him in the face of this mechanized slaughter. And yet he still clings to it. He works on cultural diplomacy, even at that time, trying to maintain contacts with intellectuals in neutral countries. He believes that after the war, Europe is going to need a new cultural order, and he dreams that he will be part of the group creating that new progressive culture. He's discharged in 1916, declared unsuitable, an honorable discharge, declared unsuitable for further military service following a doctor's report that Verdun had psychologically broken him. And At the end of the war, Germany is completely defeated. The Kaiser has fled, the empire has collapsed, revolution has erupted in Berlin. Kessler, like so many of his aristocratic class, watches the world he had known disintegrate overnight. He returns to his estate in Weimar, recording that although the house seems the same as it was in 1913, and his servants and pets greet him with affection, that his collections of paintings, statues, books, and memento seem to reflect a European intellectual and cultural community which is either dead, missing, scattered, or, quote, become enemies. He visits the former imperial palace in Berlin, which had been looted by the mutinous sailors of the High Seas Fleet who had just staged the November Revolution that had toppled the imperial house along with the rest of Germany's royal families. Kessler writes in his diary after viewing the palace, quote, "But these private apartments, the furniture, the articles of everyday use are so insipid and tasteless, so Philistine, that it is difficult to feel much indignation against the pilferers. Only astonishment that the wretched, timid, unimaginative creatures who liked this trash and frittered away their life in this precious palatial heaven amidst lackeys and sycophants could ever have made any impact on history." And he says of the former emperor, Wilhelm II, a man whom he disliked intensely, he says, quote, "This nincompoop and swaggerer who plunged Germany into misfortune, not a facet of him is capable of arousing pity or sympathy." And one of his last wartime diary entries reads, both tragically and hopefully, quote, "We stand among ruins. The monuments of our fathers lie broken. What remains? Perhaps only this: to build anew, from art, from spirit, from whatever still breathes." And that would be his mission in the years ahead, to build anew. The Weimar Republic, as fragile and chaotic as it was, became the stage on which he would attempt his most ambitious experiments of proposing a European cultural union, meeting with leaders across France and England and Germany to push for diplomatic alternatives to war. He helped found the German Peace Society and campaigned vigorously for reconciliation. He envisioned a Europe united by art, not boundaries, and his pamphlets and speeches from this period are bristling with urgency for pleading against vindictiveness and revenge, and instead for visionary peace. And so for Kessler, the end of the war is a moment of possibility. If old Europe had collapsed, well, maybe something new, something brand new and spectacular could be built from its ashes. He's actively engaged in corresponding with a number of leading figures in Europe, such as Albert Einstein, André Gide, Jean Cocteau, Virginia Woolf, Marcel Proust, George Bernard Shaw, Isadora Duncan, and Josephine Baker. And in 1919, he writes a plan for a League of Nations. A purpose of this, to prevent new wars, secure human rights, and the regulation of world trade. And he sees culture not as a decoration to all of this, but as a vital force to bind nations together in this league. In 1919, in his diary, he writes, quote, "The politicians are drawing borders in ink and blood, but the only borders that matter are those that art erases. If we cannot create a European spirit, Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles, will be nothing but a truce before the next catastrophe." Around this time, he takes his press, the Kranach press, which he had founded before the war, and really starts to devote time to it. And it's not just a publishing house, it's kind of cultural experiment. He wanted to create the books that were works of art, but he wanted to combine the best, newest, best ideas in typography, paper construction, illustration, and translation. And he pours enormous amounts of energy and money into it. Again, one of the most famous pieces is The Hamlet, published in 1929, and it's extraordinary. I'll put images on the website, but just look them up. It's so beautiful. printed in a typeface designed by the English calligrapher Edward Johnston, illustrated with woodcuts by Eric Gill, translated into German by Gerhard Hauptmann, the Nobel Prize-winning playwright. He wanted this book to be a symbol of European cooperation, of the marriage of English, German, and classical traditions. He wrote in his diary, quote, "Hamlet is not merely English, he is European, a mirror of our divided soul. To give him form anew is to bind England and Germany together, even after war." The press produces editions of Goethe, Virgil, Homer, each crafted with obsessive care. He spares no expense. He believed that beauty was not a luxury even at this time when people were struggling to make ends meet. He believed that beauty was an essential component of life, and encouraging and creating that would actually create the conditions for a nation to prosper. Alongside this publishing work that he does in the 1920s, he throws himself into very deep cultural diplomacy. He's traveling constantly between Paris, London, Geneva, Rome, meeting politicians, artists, and intellectuals, hoping to use this network of friends, this social cultural network, to rebuild trust between Germany and its former enemies. In 1922, for example, he attends the Genoa Conference, which was a major diplomatic gathering trying to put the world, the political world, back together again. But instead of focusing on reparations for countries or damages or new borders, he lobbies for cultural exchanges, art exhibitions, translations of foreign literature into home countries' languages. He once described himself half-jokingly, quote, as an ambassador of culture without portfolio. And he indeed was tireless. In Paris, he meets Jean Cocteau, André Gide, Picasso. In Berlin, he dines with Einstein, George Grosz, Walter Gropius. In Vienna, visits with Hofmannsthal, Stefan Zweig. A French writer says, quote, "Kessler seemed to know everyone, and not just to know them, but to bind them like pearls on a string. With him, a conversation over dinner became a negotiation between nations." In the Weimar Republic, Kessler's base is Berlin, and in the 1920s, that city, as I've written about in other podcasts, was electric. Nightclubs, cabaret, jazz, avant-garde theater, Bauhaus architecture. It was a playground for experimentation and a refuge, for outsiders from around Europe, and Kessler naturally was in the middle of all of it. His diaries record evenings at cabarets where Marlene Dietrich sang, afternoons in studios with painters like Max Beckmann, nights at the opera with Richard Strauss. And in 1923, during the crazy hyperinflation crisis, he writes, quote, "Tonight the cabaret was delirious. Banknotes fluttered like confetti. Men drank champagne by the crate while children begged in the streets. Berlin is dancing on a volcano." At the same time, he's attending the Weimar National Assembly, observing debates on the new constitution, and dining with ministers and diplomats. He's still pushing for his League of Nations, which he hoped could embody the European cultural spirit he dreams of. But his liberal internationalism starts to put him increasingly at odds as the 20s go along with the mood in Germany. As inflation goes crazy, unemployment worsens, nationalist resentment grows across the country. The Germans, of course, feel humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, embittered by the economic collapses of the 1920s, and Kessler's talk of art and Europe start to seem detached from reality. In 1925, after a particularly terrible meeting, he wrote, quote, "They want blood, not books. They want revenge, not reconciliation. How can one speak of Homer or Shakespeare when they demand only steel and slogans?" At the same time, he's cultivating friendships across the continent. He's discussing with Hofmannsthal, the Viennese writer, the spiritual crisis of Europe. With Rilke, he's talking about poetry and death. With Cocteau, he's talking about theater and opium. With Einstein, he's debating time and art. He was, as one friend said, quote, "a conductor of the orchestra of Europe." And yet, sometimes his diaries seem very lonely. Quote, he says, quote, I am surrounded by brilliance, yet I remain a spectator, always the witness, never the actor. Perhaps my destiny is not to create, but to record, to leave behind a mirror of what once was. And in a way, his diaries, he says he's not a brilliant man and he's not always a spectator, but his diaries become a great work of art, a huge many-volume portrait of Europe at that moment of crisis. And as the 20s go along, the cracks in Weimar are deepening. The Great Depression in 1929 devastates the economy, unemployment goes crazy, and of course extremist parties, communists on the left, Nazis on the right, are gaining ground, and Kessler's watching it all. He attends meetings where nationalist students shout down the liberals. He sees swastika flags start to appear in the streets. In 1932, he writes, quote, "The air grows poisonous. Conversations end in shouting. Newspapers drip with venom. The faces of young men harden into masks of hate. One feels the approach of a storm. Not tomorrow, perhaps, not next year, but soon." And yet he continues to work. In 1931, the Kronach Press issues a monumental edition of Goethe's Faust, which was the culmination of years of Kessler's labor, combining German poetry with illustrations by artists like Aristide Maillot, a triumph of creativity and craft and connections between different artists. And then the Nazis seize power in 1933. There's a terrible quote, truthful, bitter quote by, I think it's Walter Gropius, who says that the optimists ended up in camps and the pessimists ended up with villas in the Hollywood Hills. Kessler was not an optimist about the Nazis. He understood immediately that Hitler represented something profoundly destructive, and that for a man like him, aristocratic, liberal, cosmopolitan, gay, and a patron of what the Nazis called degenerate modern art, there would be no place in the new order, and he flees the country, first to Paris, then to Spain. He's 65 years old, and he sees the world that he had devoted his life to building, a fragile cosmopolitan culture, trying to bridge nations with the idea of art and literature and connection. All the salons and the publishing houses, the orchestras and the presses, they're annihilated almost overnight. His diary entry from March 1933 says, quote, "What we built over decades has collapsed in weeks. The men of noise and slogans rule. Books burn, artists scatter, fear thickens the air. Germany has entered its dark age." And for Kessler, that was a kind of existential ending, an existential exile to his dreams, to his life. He had defined himself as a European mediator, a man who would bring peace through connections between nations and artists and cultures. But now Europe seemed to be collapsing. France and Britain were paralyzed, unwilling to confront Hitler. Intellectuals were fleeing across borders, carrying tiny fragments of a culture that no longer had a home. And sure, maybe later those fragments would plant seeds. They would turn out to be seeds that would grow all around the world. But Kessler was in a moment when he couldn't see that. In Paris, he tries to pick up the threads. He meets with artists, but the old conversations once about moving forward now are more about survival. One friend, the artist André Gide, describes Kessler at this time as, quote, "a figure of immense dignity, but with the eyes of a man watching a funeral." He keeps working on his diaries, polishing old entries, drafting memoirs. He believed, I think, at that point that if he could no longer act as a mediator in the present, at least he could pass on to the future what he knew of the past, an archive of a civilization that he believed in. His last years are spent in Mallorca, in Spain. His health was going down. He was seeking sun and the Mediterranean climate, and he spent his last years in relative obscurity, polishing his diaries far from the salons and the conference halls where he had once been at the center of Europe's cultural life. And on November 30th, 1937, before the ultimate catastrophe of the Second World War, Harry Kessler dies in Lyon, France. He was 69. And it must have seemed at that moment that his life had been in vain, that the bridges he built had all collapsed, that his cosmopolitan dream had been swept away by nationalism and violence. But we still have his diaries, and I think his diaries are an incredible testament to hope, to possibility, to art, to the idea that we can still reach across borders that have been built by war and by violence, and we can reach across to other cultures and try and reknit connections and trust and belief and cultures. So, how to conclude Kessler's life? Well, he was a paradox. He was an aristocrat who admired revolutionaries. He was a soldier who hated war. He was a German who loved France. He was a patron of artists who made very little art himself. He called himself eventually the Red Count. He was a witness. His diaries capture the heartbeat of a civilization at its peak and at its collapse. They're filled with beautiful, intimate portraits, Rodin's silence in his studio, Einstein's laughter over dinner, Marlene Dietrich under the cabaret lights, Berlin students shouting slogans in the streets. And he never abandoned his faith that beauty mattered, that culture was worth defending. In one of his last diary entries written in exile in 1935, he writes, quote, "Perhaps my life has only been a footnote to history, but if the future wishes to know how Europe destroyed itself, it will find in these pages not an explanation, but a mirror." And at this point, when we're living again in a world where borders are hardening, when battle lines are being drawn, when there's new populism and new anger, Kessler reminds us that culture is not a luxury. It is a lifeline, something that can keep us afloat when all around us people are insisting that the only options are hatred and anger. So, once again, if some of the concerns and desires in these stories seem familiar, well, they should, because I believe the Weimar Republic helped give birth to the whole modern world. Thanks for listening. Hit subscribe or follow if you want to know more about, if you want to know when the next episode appears. And I don't have any advertising budget. I don't have a budget at all. I'm just standing around in an old cupboard. I'm surrounded by clothes, repurposing an ancient microphone, trying to deal with my own obsession and get it out there towards the world. So if you can leave a review on your app or hit the star button if you like the show, well, it encourages the podcast to be found by other listeners, and then the algorithm thingy will push it out into the world, which I guess is a good thing. Or you can just forward a link to a friend or mention it at a party. That'd be really cool as well. And I hope you'll join me in the coming months as I explore more about the strange birth, life, and death of an experiment in creating a new society. I will put images and the text for this episode onto my website, bremnersings.com, BREMNERSINGS.com. And who the hell am I to discuss the Weimar Republic? No, I am not a sociologist. No, I am not a political scientist. No, I am not a historian. I am just an obsessive artist, a singer, playwright, and cabaret performer who has been obsessed with the arts and the music and the literature and the writings and the cabaret and the architecture and all the stuff of the Weimar Republic all my life. I've recorded 3 albums dedicated to the music of this time, particularly deeply obsessed with the music of Kurt Weill and the lyrics of Bertolt Brecht, and if you want to listen to them, just search for Bremner, Fletcher, Duthie, or just Bremner Fletcher in any music streaming site, and you'll find all my albums. And if you want to know more about my work or see the images from the period or suggest a specific Weimar subject for an episode, check out bremnersings.com, BREMNERSINGS.com. Thanks a lot. Join me next time for another walk through the amazing creative madness of 1920s Germany.